What else do I get into today? In fact, all three of us been going places. Looking for things, searching for things. Going on adventures.
I know that it's great fun to intellectualize Terry's films, and you can do that, but for me, they're not intellectual so much as they're visceral. I don't know how you explain it. They're like poems, you know. You can analyze it to death, but it still is not going to get to what this poem is doing to you, to your psyche, your body, you know. It's never gonna solve that. Terry was very shy, you know, which enamored me to him immediately. I mean, he was so shy. He was so almost embarrassed about asking me about the possibility of acting, you know. And I hadn't really considered it. I mean, I was totally devoted to writing at that point, you know. And then he started talking about the script. He didn't even show me the script, you know. That time I was running a little ranch up in Northern California, and he came and visited me, and 2 or 3 times. And then one day I got a phone call. He says, "Do you want to do this movie?" I said, "Why not?" You know. So I rented a Ford Mustang and drove to Alberta, Canada. That was it. You know? I love the predicament and the situation and the era. He said something to me once about that he prefers the past. He thought there were more possibilities because of memory and time passing. So that it's really more about memory, about something recalled, something coming back. And the fact that it was that curious time, particularly in the Southwest, the turn of the century time, when the horse was being pushed out and the car was coming in and the train was coming in and all of the industrial thing was moving in. And, you know, we get so carried away with this thing of, like, progress. Because it's always called progress, right? You know, because we were exploiting the land or we were marching forward and it was manifest destiny and all this other shit, you know. But the center is the collision of these cultures, you know, this Eastern culture and this Western culture, this urban and rural collision that happened in America. It was a very crucial time. Officially, I think the frontier was closed in 1890, something like that. The frontier was, that's the end of the frontier. But in fact, the frontier was very newly discovered by the European population. So you still had this sort of very primitive culture being bumped up against by Eastern influence, you know. I mean, it's still very raw, primitive kind of existence, you know, out there in the hinterlands, you know. The characters seem to be icons of that era and that place. This figure is very typical of that place, you know. A man who tries to create a dynasty and succeeds, but yet is extraordinarily empty and alone, and never will, that will never be resolved, you know. You know, like the Citizen Kane character, it's the same, except rural. And it's a haunted character. It's a character who never has a true home. A man like that, living in that sort of solitude, his notion of who he is quite different than how we perceive it now, with our complicated ideas of personality and who we are and what we identify with. I think those people, those men particularly of that time, identified with things that had to do with the land, the horse, the cattle, water. You know, that sort of simple, direct thing. If you had a good horse, you were a better man than you would be if you were on foot. If you had good cattle, you were a better man than the man who has no cattle. They knew who they were on those very simple terms. My land goes from here to that rock over there, and then it goes over there, and those cattle are mine, those cattle aren't mine, the horse, you know what I mean? Those were the type of things that built the idea of who I am, you know. And this notion of the cowboy and of the West and of this solitary character, this person who was able to fend for himself in spite of everything else, to be self-sufficient. Very important thing, which gets more and more lost as we move into our idea of civilization. We don't have that quality anymore. We don't have that way of testing ourselves. I understood that. But what I did have to work at was a sense of not pretending, you know, not pretending to be of that place, but be of that place, you know. And through Terry, I felt this sort of haunted sense of where he came from, you know. And we both come from similar backgrounds, although, you know, he grew up in Texas and I grew up in Southern California, in the desert country of Southern California. So, but remote, this rural kind of thing, you know. And I felt Terry's hauntedness by the place, you know. Terry's haunted by place. I think that the landscape shaped those people very much, you know. It carved them in a way that it didn't in the East, because it was so harsh, you know, so stark. There are no trees, there's no water, there's no, you know, bare bones, you know. So that the way those people became who they became had to do with that landscape, you know. There's no separating it. In fact, where we shot up there in Alberta is also very similar in a way, culturally, to the Southwest. They said that the old abandoned houses, people used to pioneer close by the old abandoned houses and put lights in those houses so that they would feel less alone. Just the imagination that they had company. That's how lonesome it was. I don't think any character is pure. That character is tainted by jealousy. You know, he's immediately like he's on fire. You know, he's like Othello. But also, see, I think it's a deep part of that cultural thing too, that pioneer cultural thing, which had to do with a Christian ethic that was very much involved with jealousy. It's not as forgiving as we would like to think. You know? Like the Salem witch trial. He's ready to kill.
Wait! You're a liar!
There's a great temptation to moralize about murder, the right and wrong, you know. I don't think it's so much about that. I mean, I don't think Terry's so interested in the morality, the right and wrong. It's the predicament. It's the situation. It's this contrast between the manipulative, big city, corrupt thing and this innocence. You know that all of these little people, all these characters are doomed. You know, they're just doomed. Terry told me very early on that he wanted to make a silent movie. He didn't want dialogue. And I knew what he meant, you know, that dialogue somehow engaged the audience too much, that he wanted almost a voyeuristic thing from the audience, you know, to witness the image. And that dialogue interfered with that because it engages, you know, that's the function of dialogue, it pulls you in. Terry was meticulous, you know, the way his attention to detail. And I don't think I've encountered that since then, that kind of attention to detail. I remember the sand cranes that were brought in specially to be shot. And I think that's the vulnerable side of it, you know, that he's kind of in awe of nature in a way. I think those things were very important to him, and it frustrated the crew, you know, which was a basically conventional Hollywood crew, because sometimes Terry'd be all set up to do a scene, and there would be a flight of geese across the sky. He'd get everybody to turn the cameras and shoot this thing because it was happening right then, you know, and the crew would be going, kind of, what is this bullshit, you know? And then it would be like this absolutely gorgeous shot, you know, in natural light. There it was. But that's one of the parts of his genius, I think, is this ability to see the moment, you know, and say, okay, now, if we don't get this, we'll never get it. And to ignore the conventions of how you shoot a movie. It's frustrating for an actor because of Terry's temperament, I think. You know, it's very frustrating for an actor. But an actor has to continually realize that they're in the presence of something that they have to respect in another way. You know, you can't expect a filmmaker like Terry, for instance, to have an attitude of indulgence toward the actor. So if you're a spoiled actor, you're not going to get along with Terry. You have to be independent. You have to be able to come and say, I'm an actor, he's a director, and I'm going to listen to everything he says, and I'm not going to expect him to spoon-feed me my motivation or whatever the hell else you need. You know, you have to be your own person. I started to slowly get the impression, even though it was very frustrating for me, you know, to work in those circumstances, but slowly I got the impression that I was involved in something really extraordinary. And the more I worked with Terry, the more I got that impression. That he wasn't just trying to make a movie, that he was trying to make something that would last. You know, filmmaking is an extraordinarily difficult art form. I mean, the process by which this image gets to the point where now it's on screen and it's involved with a bunch of other sympathetic images, you know, it's mind-boggling, you know. That's why I'd rather write, you know. It's crazy.